The beach here in Neskowin in South Tillamook County is a good place to consider what government is or is not doing to help coastal communities adapt to the likely effects of climate change. We've chosen this community because over the past decade it has been severely affected by winter storms and resulting beach and shoreline erosion. These problems are driven by changing climate cycles and other large-scale trends affecting the ocean. You can see firsthand what the response to serious erosion has been over the last decade. More than 2 miles along the shore here has been fortified with rock. Riprap, it's called. In Oregon, the beach is a state recreation area open to all. Property owners must apply for and receive a permit to build these protective structures. Likewise, a permit from Tillamook County is needed to build a house along the beach. County regulations for such construction were approved by the state land use agency back in 1985 when our understanding of climate variability and long-term climate trends was in its infancy. The shore protection structures here and elsewhere along the coast fix the shoreline in place. Yet the storm waves continue to come, further eroding the beach, undermining the rock structures, and placing the homes, streets, and utilities behind them at a risk of loss. Today, scientists tell us that these waves are getting bigger. While global warming is causing sea level to rise at an accelerated rate around the world, Oregon is not likely to be affected as much as some other places by sea level rise because our coast is geologically being lifted upward in many places. Still, the trends are clear. The shoreline is moving landward and will continue to do so. In the meantime, new and ever more expensive homes continue to be built in coastal high hazard zones. So what are the effects on the beach of these trends of climate change and development? What beach, you might say? With the shoreline fixed in place with rock walls, our famously public beaches are disappearing in some areas. And that trend is likely to continue and accelerate. Here at Neskowin, walking on the beach is sometimes risky, especially at high tide. Problem is, along the ocean shore, private rights to build on and protect one's property bump up against the public's right to use and enjoy the beaches. Eventually, scientists say, the question will be moot. Over time, the shoreline will move inland, seawalls will fail, and homes will be flooded or have to be moved. We will adapt one way or the other. But when and how do we make that transition? Because it affects people's property, this matter is serious. So what are state and local government agencies doing now or planning to do to make this transition as painless as possible? To get a perspective from the top, the man to ask is Bob Bailey, Oregon's Coastal Program Manager. Bob oversees the state land use program as it relates to coastal resources like beaches, dunes, and bluffs, and for addressing issues like coastal hazards. But it's not just a job for Bob. He grew up on the coast and has cared about it for a long time.
The biggest amount of work is probably going to be in adaptation, in the preparation for climate change, just because we think there are a variety of potential effects on the coast that aren't going to occur elsewhere, principally driven by rising sea level and changes in ocean chemistry and things like that, in invasive species and so on. Oregon's got a great advantage in having a land use planning program in every jurisdiction. So right there, we're a step ahead of many, many other areas in the country in that there's a framework, there's a certain level of understanding and professional capacity and political momentum to deal with changes in the community, whether it's driven by climate change or economics or whatever. That said, I think some communities are better prepared than others to work on climate change, to adapt, to plan for, to assess risk. And clearly those have to do with how much funding they've got. You know, because a lot of coastal communities, really, the smaller ones are very shoestring operations. And even over the last 15 years, we've seen all the development demands. That's really taxed their energy. In an odd sort of way, climate change comes at an interesting time as those development demands have tapered off. And so they can turn their attention a little bit more to at least thinking about climate change. But clearly, I think everybody's going to need some more resources. If you're going to go through community visioning process, to engage citizens, to work through schools, to really help people understand and mobilize for this effort, it's going to take some resources, and we really don't have them right now. The fact is that we don't really have the information we need at the scale that local governments need it, and we don't have right now the financial resources to go get that information, or to really provide local governments with the resources that they need to redo their comp plans, to set up task forces, to go through the community process. So we lack money and we lack information.
Do we need to update state land use policies to adapt to the changes you foresee?
I don't think that Oregon's going to need to really revise a substantial number of policies within the land use program. I feel we've got the basic policy toolkit to deal with climate change across a variety of effects. The statewide planning program and the tools that all local governments have and that state agencies, the coordination that's built in, our ability to discuss many of the issues that will be, whether it's coastal hazards, geologic hazards, whether it's transportation and growth management, we've got those tools right now. This is not a new discussion for us. I think what is new is to figure out an appropriate way to create a new lens through which we look at all of our current and oncoming issues through the lens of climate change, and to appreciate how fundamentally different things will be over time, and do all that we can to appreciate how those changes will play out at a local level. We're not under the gun, we don't have to do this tomorrow, but it is a conversation that we need to really work on thoughtfully and carefully, because in my view, reading the literature, and it's voluminous, or the Oregon coast in particular is going to look very different in the lifetime of my children and my grandchildren.
Having a broad coast-wide understanding of how the coast will change and how government can help are essential at the state level. Still, it's the coastal governments that will be most directly involved in preparing their communities. And to understand the coastal county perspective on climate change preparation, who better to talk to than Matt Spangler? For many years, Matt directed the Lincoln County Planning Division, which administers and maintains the county's locally adopted comprehensive land use plan and code.
I think there's a lot of discussion generally about climate change. That discussion is probably further along out here on the coast. Folks are much more aware that that is coming, and they seem to be much more accepting of the idea that we're in for some changes. We don't necessarily completely understand what all of those might be, but we know things are going to change. The problems that are on your plate today, of course, get the most attention, and it's sometimes hard to convince folks that it would be wise to expend ever scarcer resources on events that maybe nobody can quite visualize because they're too far into the future.
So you're not sitting around the office waiting for the phone to ring?
Yeah, no.
Government officials aren't supposed to laugh and be regular guys, are they?
I think one area of climate change that we really need to think a lot more about is going to be the general disruption in weather patterns and what that's going to do to a lot of our general ecosystem processes that are in place right now. Some of those are just unpredictable, but there's no question some of those systems that we rely upon in the natural cycle are probably going to change significantly, and we definitely need to look at that.
Turning to specific areas of risk, how do you handle building setbacks in hazardous areas?
Building setbacks in hazardous areas, particularly along the ocean shore, are generally handled through site-specific engineering geologic reports. We try to obviously get our practitioners to take into account all of the latest scientific information, and that's especially hard to do with this whole issue of climate change because there's just so much uncertainty. I mean, we understand quite a bit qualitatively, but to really put numbers and quantify that is very difficult right now. You know, regulation of development on bluff faces along the ocean shore is been kind of an inexact science. We have regulations, and they're probably based on the best science that we had at that time, but there's a lot of new information developing, especially a lot of this information about the potential effects of climate change. And so that's probably one area that we really need to look more carefully at and do some more work in.
Many other coastal government officials would likely agree. In fact, a Sea Grant survey of 300 Oregon coast decision makers in 2008 showed that they're quite aware both that climate change poses significant risks and they need to gather information relevant to their locale and take prudent steps. Where planning and change often collide is on the shoreline, in places like Neskowin, where we began. When property owners feel vulnerable, they seek to protect themselves, and in Oregon that requires a permit. Tony Stein is one of those who reviews those permits as the North Coast Land Use Coordinator for the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department.
Joe, what we're seeing is recently in the last 10 years or so, we're seeing a trend towards larger waves, more frequent storms, and higher tide surges. So some of the structures that we have, existing legacy structures, like this one behind me, they're receiving more of a pounding on the structure themselves. So some of these really weren't designed for the sort of regime we're in now. And so some of the new permits that we're going to see, I think in the near future, we're going to have to look at designs that are much more tougher as far as construction, either larger rocks or construction in a size that can withstand some of the pressure that we're seeing.
How do you evaluate permit applications for riprap or other shore protection structures?
We have our coastal hazard maps that show low, moderate, and high locations. In evaluating specific projects, the applicant usually submits a geologic report with the application. We look closely at the severity of erosion, the rate of erosion, how far of a setback does the existing structure have from the edge of the bluff or the bank, and any recent trends in erosion on that beach within the specific area and a longer stretch of the beach. Properties that were developed prior to January 1st, 1977 are eligible for shoreline protection. And there are many places on the coast where there was development, homes were built, or other infrastructure that does not meet that requirement. So it's a key part of the application when we evaluate it. In the long term, I suppose that I think we really need to look at some of the communities that are susceptible to some of these increasing or gradual sea level rise or wave height increases, and look at how we're going to address the issue, because you can do a lot of riprapping to front and protect some of the infrastructure, but you still have low points like river mouths, water going up around a river and behind homes, in a combination with possible heavy rainfall and flooding on the upland side. So it's a larger, broader issue that I think needs to be addressed. How are communities going to make that adjustment? What communities need to look at, probably from a grassroots level rather than changing any laws, is becoming more informed and looking at their community and the possible coastal hazards that could arise.
And yet, like Bob Bailey and Matt Spangler, you know them, you have a long personal history at the coast, isn't that right?
Well, I've got a long history. I grew up on the coastline. I've lived on the coast my whole life. I've seen a lot of changes on all of the North American continents. I've had the opportunity to travel a lot. And so I'm a frequent ocean user for recreation and just for my lifestyle. And it's very important to me personally. And not just for me, but for everyone who lives in my community and in the state of Oregon. I think it's just an incredible resource, and it's something that's just valuable and worth protecting.